we thought we'd do a takeover of Bavard Bar tonight. So for my part, I'm going to talk to you about funerals. Maybe get you to think about what you might like for your funeral. But before I do that, I'm going to take you on a little tour around history of funerals. A lot of my slides, the presentation is very history based, so I'm going to get moving on it and take you straight away to Goat's Hole, which is a cave on the Gower Peninsula. And in 1823, the remains of a man was found here, along with various pieces of jewellery made from shells, silver and bone. Dated to over 33,000 years ago, it's recognised as being the oldest human burial in Western Europe. A little more up to date, only 5,000 years ago, and the nomadic tribes of the time built mounds over the final resting places of their leaders to create what are known as barrows in England and cairns in Scotland. Barrows differ from cairns in that the tomb is covered with soil rather than stones. You've got an example of a few different ones here. In the Bronze Age, the dead were buried in individual tombs called cists. This is like an upright version of the graves that we know now. A four-sided hole was dug, supported with 4 stone slabs placed on end around the sides. The body was placed inside, usually with the knees drawn up to the chest, and the cyst topped with another stone slab. Cremation later became popular, only very briefly, and ornamental urns of ashes were placed into the cyst. Have we moved on yet? No. As with Goat's Hole, double whammy. As with Goat's Hole, the remains found in barrows, cairns and cists were usually interred with jewellery, weapons or evidence of sacrifice, and the bones of around 184 cattle were found alongside the remains of one Bronze Age burial. And eating and drinking vessels were also common, suggesting a belief in the afterlife, because everyday items required now would presumably be needed after death. So here we have a ship burial, not a burial at sea, and the remains of this were found at Sutton Hoo. So I don't know if anyone knows or has been to Sutton Hoo. It's quite an amazing excavation there. And it was thought this was the burial of a king, covered in fur, with weapons, his helmet, blanket and pots, as well as his ship buried with him. So the slide you've already seen. A few examples of more recent things that people have requested to be buried with. So in the UK, funeral directors will fulfil most requests as long as they're legal, and that includes what goes into the coffin. And there are some restrictions, especially around cremations, nothing combustible, for example, which you think would be quite obvious, but otherwise you need only ask. Before he was executed for treason in 1618, Sir Walter Raleigh asked that he be buried with his favourite pipe and tobacco, and that his coffin be lined with wood from cigar boxes. And at the end of the 19th century, a New Yorker was popped into his tomb in his favourite chair. He asked for 2 keys to be cut, one to be put in his coat pocket and one to be used to lock the tomb before being thrown away. When Humphrey Bogart died, legend has it that Lauren Bacall put a whistle in the urn with Bogart's ashes, inscribed with the words, "If you need me, just blow." More recently, an American woman was so devastated when her husband died that she buried him with his mobile so she could call him and leave a message. She also had the number engraved on his headstone so that anyone passing by could also give him a quick call. And last I heard, she's still paying for his contract. In the UK, a woman asked that her cat be put down and buried with her. Fortunately for the cat, the funeral director refused. So we go back to the history tour, and in Tudor times, before the Reformation, a priest would be, this is where I'm really kind of reading, I've got so many words here, in Tudor times, before the Reformation, a priest would be summoned to hear the dying person's confession. He would anoint them with oil and ask God to forgive their sins. With Henry VIII's intervention, this practice, extreme unction, was abolished in 1552. But a priest would still visit the dying, give them communion and urge them to repent their sins. If it was too late, a sin eater could be hired. This sounds like quite a good job to me. This person would visit the home and have bread and beer passed to them over the dead body. It was believed that by doing so, they took on the dead person's sins. The parish bell would ring out to announce the death. The body would then be placed in a shroud with herbs or flowers and would usually stay in the family home until the funeral, with the women of the house keeping vigil. Only the rich could afford coffins and headstones, so those with less money would be carried to church in a coffin, but buried only in their shroud in an unmarked grave. At the time of the funeral, the church bell would ring out again, and afterwards the family would come together with the whole parish to share food and drink. I think that sounds like quite a good way of doing it, really. But however, there's no expense spared for royalty, and the procession for Elizabeth I's funeral was vast, and her tomb in Westminster Abbey is very ornate, sitting across the aisle from her half-sister Mary, who she had executed some years before. Now, with the Great Plague in 1665, it had the most devastating effect on London, and during 1 month alone, over 31,000 people died. So it meant that funerals were pretty difficult, as there weren't many left to bury the dead, and those who hadn't died fled the city, often taking the illness with them. Mass burials in plague pits were the norm, and these vast pits were dug and the dead rather unceremoniously slung into them. Later on in the 17th century, the Burial in Woolen Act of 1678 was passed, requiring that the dead, with the exception of plague victims and the poor, be buried in English woolen shrouds, and failure to comply resulted in a £5 fine, with half going to the informer and half to the poor of the parish. And many were very disgruntled by this law and wanted to bury their dead in whatever they chose, and so happily paid the fine. So it wasn't until Victorian times that funerals started to become big business. When Prince Albert died, church bells tolled throughout the land, special church services held, and shops closed as a mark of respect. It was only when letters started appearing in the Times, complaining about the impact that this sort of public mourning had on trade, that it let up slightly. The bereaved were often led into spending more money than was necessary, though fortunately there were funerals available for everyone. A mid-century ad in the Times offered 6 classes of funeral, ranging in price from £3, 5 shillings to £21. Mourning followed a strict protocol and was a very big business. Mourning dress outfitters did a roaring trade, selling the correct funeral attire. There were smaller specialist companies, mourning milliners, for example. Not only was the family expected to mourn and to dress appropriately, their servants might be expected to join in too. Peter Robinson's in London's Regent Street advertised mourning for servants at very low prices. And although expected to mourn for a couple of years, women of wealthier classes were advised against attending the funeral itself. It was thought that the frequent practice of drinking before and after the funeral service, not only by the funeral party, but also by the undertaker and his staff, would prove just too upsetting. So the bereaved woman did most of the organisation of the funeral and had to be seen to do the right thing. It was as though the bigger the funeral and display of grief, the bigger the mourning. At that time, there was funeral stationery, funeral jewellery, and of course the funeral mute. Provided by the undertaker, a funeral mute would lead the procession into the church, and you may remember it was a job Mr. Sowerberry bestowed on Oliver in Oliver Twist. Headstones were no longer enough, and memorial statues and mausoleums became the done thing. It was all bigger equals better, not just keeping up with the Joneses, but going beyond them. During this time, the surging population of big cities, especially London, was huge. London cemeteries became full and an alternative was needed. So the London Necropolis Company, who knew, was founded for this reason. It was a cemetery operator put in place by an Act of Parliament in 1852. The company opened Brookwood Cemetery in Woking in 1854 and laid on a train service from its own station at the side of Waterloo to one in the cemetery itself. It was then the largest cemetery in the world and one of the few to allow funerals on Sundays. It became popular with poorer people who could attend a funeral without the need for taking a day off work. And Sunday funerals were also popular with actors who have a dedicated section of the cemetery near to the station entrance, as theatres were closed on Sundays. The station at Brookwood had rooms for the funeral reception to take place after the service, However, demand for Brookwood dropped by the late 19th century, and the daily train service was cut back to 2 trains a week by the late 1920s. After suffering heavy bomb damage during World War II, the London station was closed. And one reason the need for Brookwood burials had dropped was that the cremation had been legalised, and although it had been used in ancient Britain, it was frowned upon by the church as it conflicted with the Christian view of the resurrection. And it wasn't until the early 19th century, when some British officials in India started campaigning for a crematoria to be built, that it was mooted as something that could be done in Britain. However, the proposals were blocked by the church and the government, and the subject wasn't raised again until 1874, when the Secular Cremation Society was formed. It argued for cremation on the grounds of hygiene and space. It bought land near to Brookwood and built the UK's first crematorium. However, it was not a popular thing and didn't take off probably until like the First World War, and it was then that crematoria started to be used more regularly commercially, but cremation didn't compete with burial until the 60s, and now today over 70% of funerals are at crematoria. And that has seen the rise in the funeral undertaker. And it used to be that any tradesperson undertaking a task was called an undertaker, and so you had a funeral undertaker. By the 17th century, the word funeral had been dropped, and as other tradespeople didn't want the death association, it was left to the person who undertook funerals. Undertakers have always battled with their reputation, and in 1898 a national organisation was set up to raise the status of the profession. Still going strong, it's changed its name to the National Association of Funeral Directors, the new name coming from the more public ceremonial role played at the funeral itself. Undertakers until the early 20th century would have made the coffins too, hence the aprons worn by the staff from Haynes & Son, which is located, as it was then, in South Street. Until the mid-20th century, a standard funeral would follow the same process. The local doctor would certify a death, the local layer-out, usually a woman, would come in and tend to the last offices of both the bereaved and the deceased. She would call on the parish priest and summon the undertaker to take measurements for a coffin. The undertaker would deliver the coffin, as sometimes having to take the window out if the door was too narrow. The deceased would be dressed in their best nightwear or Sunday suit, placed in the coffin in the front parlour until the funeral, which usually took place 3 or 4 days after death. In the late 1950s, mortuaries became an addition at the undertakers, so coffins were being mass-produced and the undertaker had more room on site, so it was no longer necessary to keep the body at home. So, where are we now? The law. The law states that you must follow the laws around the registration of the death. You need a medical certificate from the hospital or GP in order to register the death, and then you have to do that within 5 days. You'll then have the documents needed for the funeral, the death certificate and the burial or cremation form called the green certificate. You then appoint a funeral director, or you can do it yourself. The requirement is the body is properly disposed of, either by burial or cremation. The rest really is up to you. The type of funeral in the UK today is often dictated by the person's religion, their culture and customs, as well as their own and the bereaved's wishes. And with the choice available, more and more people are opting for a funeral that represents and celebrates the deceased life, rather than following any strict protocol. And unfortunately, funerals come at a price, and with the average UK funeral now costing just under £4,000, it's understandable that there's been a rise in funeral poverty and the need for public health funerals. Around 1 in 7 struggle to pay, claiming for a benefit called the funeral payment. And running parallel to that is a rise of an increase in DIY funerals. Doing it yourself keeps costs down and gives the proceedings more of a personal touch. Family and friends can get really involved at a time when most feel completely helpless. There's been a rise in woodland burials, the use of alternative coffins. That's George Mellie's cardboard coffin that the family decorated over there. Going off in a sidecar or a camper van, so on and so forth. And funeral directors can be involved as much or as little as needed. So, and then you've got other ideas. How about screening the funeral live so that people who can't attend can see it? You can blast the ashes into space, have them made into a diamond, whatever you like. Send them up in fireworks, bury them with a tree, that kind of thing. There's been a huge surge in business of things to do specifically with ashes. And there's a pretty grim trend in the States at the moment for the body to be embalmed and posed at the funeral reception. So it's a really good selfie opportunity. And the next slide is of some of these bodies. So if you're feeling faint-hearted, I'd look away. But here they are. This lady's got her beer and her cigarette, which is quite good. Anyway, I'm almost done. And just to take you, once you've got over all of that, just to take to my mum. This is my mum Heather, who lives with me. She's 91. She was at her own funeral. She's very much alive. She spoke to me a few years ago about wanting a pre-funeral funeral. She said, isn't it amazing how people say really good things about you at the funeral, but you're not there to hear them? I'd really like to be there. So we arranged what we called her This Is Your Life party in a local hotel. And the celebrant who conducted my stepfather's funeral put together my mum's life story from the horse's mouth, which was really good, rather than us trying to piece it together afterwards. And I found photos that went with it, and he put together a really amazing presentation with poems and music, just like at a normal funeral, except there was my mum sitting in the front row, lapping it all up. After he'd finished, anyone that wanted to got up and told Mum exactly what they thought of her. It was all good. And there was a name change for the event in the end. My teenage niece, who lives in Ireland and has quite a Catholic upbringing, had the concept explained to her. She was quite surprised, and then said, "Oh, Granny's awake," and it struck. So that's me done. Now it's over to you. Any thoughts or questions? Any ideas of how you might like to go as well?
Thank you very much.